Hello everyone and welcome to week 5 of your Durham MEMSA community course. Today's lecture is on the subject of dining with disease, eating food during outbreaks of plague in early modern England. In the early modern period, food had a deeply significant relationship to health and healing. Now, before we start today's lecture, why don't you take a moment to pause this video here and take a look at the handout provided. Here you'll find a menu listing a range of early modern foods. We'd like you to read through the menu and decide what you would choose to eat during an outbreak of plague. At the end of the lecture, we'll invite you to return to your choices and see if, in light of the evidence provided by this course, you might have changed your mind. At the heart of the relationship between food and health were the theories of the 4 humours and the 6 non-naturals. In order to fully understand the rationale behind the foods consumed by early modern people during outbreaks of plague, it will be worth just briefly explaining these theories here. The 4 humours and the 6 non-naturals were categories in ancient Greek medicine which needed to be balanced in order to maintain health. They first appeared among the writings contained in the Hippocratic corpus. These and other classical corpuses of medical knowledge flourished and spread throughout the Middle Ages thanks to the work of Arabic commentators and translators and remained popular throughout the early modern period. It was believed that the human body was composed of 4 different humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, also known as choler, and black bile, which was also known as melancholy. These fluids defined what was known as the complexion or temperament of the body, and they had to be carefully balanced in order to maintain health. The internal workings of the bodily humours were influenced by external factors known as the non-naturals. The 6 non-naturals included air, motion and rest or exercise, sleep, food and drink, excretion and the emotions. Again, an imbalance in any of these elements, too much or too little exercise, for example, or an overexertion of the passions, was thought to be at the root of many contemporary illnesses. Like humours, foods were thought to have hot, cold, wet, or dry qualities. The image on the slide here shows how these elements related to one another. The diet, therefore, had to be carefully balanced to ensure that the body wasn't overwhelmed by a particular humour. The management of one's diet was of particular importance during outbreaks of plague, when humoral balance was believed to offer protection against the deadly infection. However, these rules were by no means universal. An individual's unique makeup could very much alter which foods were safe and which were dangerous to consume. There were, however, some general rules that appeared frequently in the medical treatises and recipe books of the period, and over the next 20 minutes, we are going to provide a short introduction exploring how early modern people dined with disease.
In order to prevent contracting the plague, medical practitioners recommended avoiding a variety of foods with the advent of an epidemic. In the first part of this lecture, we'll explore just a few of the foods deemed particularly hazardous by physicians and other medical professionals. If you were living through a plague epidemic, one type of food you should probably avoid would be anything dairy. The main dairy products consumed in the early modern period would have been milk, cheese, cream and butter. Physicians warned about the risks of eating dairy products due to their excessively dry nature and their ability to spoil easily. However, during outbreaks of plague, medical practitioners warned against the consumption of dairy entirely. Milk was a particularly dangerous substance. In some instances, it was thought to be useful. For example, milk was sometimes used to sweeten plague medicines or draw infectious vapours from the houses of plague victims. For the most part, however, milk was believed to cause corruption and adversely alter the body's humoral composition. In 1593, Simon Kelway advised his readers not to drink milk because it quickly corrupts in the stomach. This advice continued to be given well into the 17th century. At the advent of the 1625 plague outbreak in London, medical practitioner Stephen Bradwell echoed Kelway's advice by stating how milk soon corrupts in the stomach and therefore is disallowed. Some writers insinuated that the consumption of milk could be lethal. In William Kemp's treatise on the plague, he implied that those that consume milk during the fever never live long after to complain of the hurt it did them. Cheese was another culprit of illness in the early modern period, and particularly during outbreaks of plague. Like its counterpart milk, cheese should be avoided at all costs. Kelway and Bradwell, who both discouraged the consumption of milk, offered similar opinions on eating cheese. Kelway explained how cheese engenders gross and thick humours, while Bradwell believed that eating cheese was fuming and binding, and these were qualities considered to be dangerous in food consumption. Warnings against the consumption of cheese demonstrate how eating food was integrally linked to the physiological health of the body. By eating cheese, the four humours became imbalanced and the body became vulnerable to infection and disease. Cheese was feared by so many during outbreaks of plague that one practitioner called William Simpson wrote of how some will sweat, tremble and fear, even at the mere sight of cheese. Alongside dairy, meat was believed to be dangerous to eat, especially during outbreaks of plague. Due to the sheer variety of meats available for consumption in this period, medical practitioners often advise which types of meat should be eaten and from where they should be bought or caught. Meats could putrefy easily, causing humoral imbalances that left the body susceptible to plague infection. Practitioner Thomas Lodge recommended that meat should be avoided because it may easily putrefy in the stomach and breed oppilation and obstruction that heats the blood and humours and makes them vicious and sharp. Fish was also to be avoided because they do soon corrupt in the stomach. If the patient desired fish, they were to be caught from specific locations such as stony places. One meat deemed particularly dangerous was pork. In a pamphlet concerning the risks of isolating people within their households, the author listed a number of ways in which people succumbed to the plague. One of these was through the eating of pork and bacon. Meat which was already foul before being purchased was the most dangerous type of meat. Butchers trying to sell foul meat would often deceive the consumer by blowing into their meat. Doing so would make the meat look fresh and healthy. However, this practice also contaminated the meat with the butcher's infectious breath. Several authors writing during London's 1665 plague outbreak included a plea to their local authorities within their pamphlets and posters. This plea demanded that butchers be regulated due to their reputation for selling hazardous and infectious wares. The author outlined how butchers were stinking fellows who blew up their meat with their filthy, pocky, stinking, putrefied breath, whereby they putrefy the flesh, and thereby are unknown diseases communicated to the people, which is the cause of so many calamitous and strange distempers. The final food to avoid that we'll be discussing today was that of sweet foods. In 1625, practitioner Stephen Bradwell warned against the consumption of muscadel and malago. He says that their sweet taste and that dullness of spirit which is caused by them betrays their unfitness in times of contagion. The naturally occurring sweet tastes of particular foods and drinks cause them to be perceived as dangerous and potentially contagious. Whereas bitter tastes were believed to counteract the corruption caused by the plague, sweet tastes increase the body's vulnerability to illness and infection. As well as encouraging his readers to avoid eating sweet-tasting foods, Bradwell recommended that they also avoid sweet-tasting sauces. Early modern people garnished their food with sauces and herbs in similar ways to how we do today. However, these sauces and herbs carried heavier meanings in the past than they do to us today. Bradwell advised, "Let not your sauces be sweet, for such increase choler, nor too full of taste, for that whets the appetite beyond the nature of desire, and provokes to too liberal feeding. Eating foods with sweet sauces would lead to an increase in the amount of choler in the body. This increase changed the humoral composition and would lead to vomiting and an unpleasant bitter taste in the mouth. The sweet and full taste of the sauces also increased people's vulnerability to plague by causing them to want to eat in excess. The term liberal feeding refers to the sin of gluttony. Given that many people believe that the plague was caused by sin, it's important to avoid eating in excessive amounts to prevent bringing the plague upon oneself."
So the question remains, what should people eat during outbreaks of plague? In the second half of this lecture, we'll explore some of the foods that were believed by contemporaries to offer some sort of protection against the disease. We've already seen that physicians recommend that their patients avoid sweet-tasting sauces as they encourage dangerously excessive eating. The alternative was a sharp-tasting sauce, which was significantly less pleasant to taste. The 16th century physician Jan van der Noot insisted that all manner of sauces during outbreaks of plague shall be made with lemons, oranges, and sour garnet apples, combined with a special powder consisting of the best cinnamon that can be had, alongside ginger, cloves, cardamom, saffron, and other spices. Another comestible that appears repeatedly in medical treatises is vinegar. As a cold food, vinegar was believed to be a natural corrective working against the hot putrefaction of the plague. It helped to maintain the body's delicate humoral balance by closing the pores, thereby preventing miasmatic vapours and poisons of all kinds from entering the body and rising to the brain. One contemporary writer went so far as to argue that vinegar had the power to aid recovery as well as to help prevent infection. "'Tis vinegar that keeps fish, as salmon and oysters and the like, which otherwise would soon corrupt, from rottenness and stinking. And if it would not do the like for flesh, why hath it been so much used for the embalming of dead corpses? Nay, it doth not only preserve, but recover flesh from corruption. Roast stinking meat, and baste it with vinegar, and it shall neither offend your nose or palate." As heavy meats like beef, bacon, or pork could engender the blood and putrefy the stomach, Thomas Lodge promoted the consumption of light meats such as veal, lamb, chicken, capon, and pullet, which could be easily digested. One contemporary author believed that it was best to avoid meats which had been hunted. The act of hunting animals like hares or deer poisoned their flesh very much by tiring their bodies and weakening their spirits. And it was this infinite working of the passions or fear in them that held the potential to weaken and poison the human body. In general, meats were roasted rather than boiled, pickled, or baked, and allowed to cool fully before consumption. Even the common meat pie was to be opened as soon as it comes out of the oven, and so let it breathe itself till it be cold. Bread was a staple of the early modern diet, but even this had to be carefully monitored during outbreaks of plague. Van der Noot argued that bread should be white, 1 or 2 days old, well leavened and baked with aniseed and salt. Similarly, in his 1625 pamphlet, A Watchman for the Pest, Stephen Bradwell urged his readers to be wary of musty, mouldy bread, and to avoid eating it hot or before it was at least a day old. "It is best," he writes, "from them that can have ovens at home, not to send their bread to other houses to be baked, nor to receive any continually from the hand of common bakers who serve many several houses."
What we've attempted to demonstrate today is that food was inextricably intertwined with health and disease. What you ate or didn't eat could have serious consequences on your bodily health and could leave you particularly susceptible to illness. Just as people believed that the early modern body was made up of humours and elements, so too did people believe that their foods could be hot or cold, dry or wet, and ultimately safe or deadly. As well as considering the types of foods they consumed, people who lived through plague outbreaks also had to consider the taste of their foods. Nowadays, we eat sweet foods because we enjoy the taste. In the 1600s, however, eating sweet food for enjoyment was one of the most dangerous and sinful acts possible. It was undoubtedly an invite to dine with disease. Now would be a good time to reflect on the foods you may or may not have chosen from the menu we looked at the start of this lecture on the handout. If you ate the foods you initially chose, would you have survived a plague epidemic, or would you succumb to a deadly diet? The foods we eat today might not seem so different from those that people ate 400 years ago. However, how we perceive these foods has changed drastically.
Thank you for listening to today's lecture. We really hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to join us on Friday at 7:30 for a Zoom discussion where we will be answering all of your questions and chatting about the material discussed in today's lecture. But until then, we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.